Hi everyone, welcome back to Learn English with Podcast. I'm Nikki.
And I'm Tony. How's it going, Nikki?
Pretty good, Tony. Excited for today's topic. We have a really interesting one lined up. We're going to talk about bad habits learning English. This is something everyone who's tried to learn a new language can relate to.
Absolutely. Bad habits can sneak up on you and really slow down your progress if you're not careful. But don't worry, we're here to help you identify and overcome them. And of course, we'll have some fun along the way. So, Nikki, what do you think is one of the most common bad habits people have when learning English?
Well, there are quite a few, but one that stands out to me is over-relying on translation. Trying to translate everything directly from your native language into English. It can make sentences sound awkward and unnatural.
Oh, for sure. I remember when I first started learning English, I would spend so much time translating in my head before I spoke. It made conversations really slow and frustrating. It's like having a little translation machine in your brain that just doesn't work fast enough.
Exactly. And it's exhausting, right? Instead of thinking in English, you're always stuck in this translation loop. I had the same issue when I was learning. But once I started to think directly in English, everything got easier.
That's a great point. And thinking in English helps you become more fluent and natural in your conversations. What about another bad habit, Nikki?
Another big one is the fear of making mistakes. I used to be so afraid of saying something wrong that I would just stay quiet. But staying quiet doesn't help you improve. The only way to get better is to practice. And that means making mistakes.
Oh, I can totally relate to that. I used to be terrified of speaking in front of people because I thought they would laugh at my mistakes. But you know what? Most people are very understanding and supportive when you're learning a new language.
That's true, Tony. I think we all have this fear of being judged, but in reality, making mistakes is how we learn. I remember joining a conversation club where everyone was learning English. We all made mistakes, but it was such a supportive environment that it really helped me improve.
That sounds like a great idea. When I started, I tried to practice with friends who were also learning. We would talk to each other in English, and it made a big difference. Plus, it was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Learning with others can be very motivating. And speaking of motivation, we've got some amazing guests today who will share their own stories about bad habits in learning English. They've got some great tips and funny experiences to share.
Yes. We'll hear some interesting stories, learn new words, and hopefully help our listeners recognize and overcome their own bad habits. So, stay tuned.
Before we get to our guests, Tony, do you have any funny stories about your own language learning journey?
Oh, definitely. I remember once I was trying to order food at a restaurant and I got the words mixed up. Instead of asking for a chicken sandwich, I asked for a kitchen sandwich. The waiter was so confused.
Oh no, that's hilarious. But it's a perfect example of how mistakes are just part of the process. They make for great stories later on.
Exactly. So, to all our listeners out there, don't be afraid to make mistakes, embrace them and learn from them. And now, let's get ready to meet our guests and hear their stories. This is going to be a lot of fun.
We have some special guests today who will share their experiences with bad habits in learning English. Let's introduce our first guest.
Yes, let's do that. Our first guest today is Maria. Welcome to the show, Maria.
Hi, Nikki and Tony.
It's great to have you here, Maria. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your experience with learning English?
Sure, I'm Maria, and I've been learning English for about 3 years now. One of my biggest struggles was trying to learn individual words without understanding how they fit into sentences. I used to study long lists of vocabulary, but I didn't really know how to apply the words in conversations.
That's a common issue, Maria. Can you give us an example of how this affected your learning?
Absolutely. I remember learning the word run. I knew it meant to move quickly on foot, but I didn't know any other meanings or how to use it in different contexts. So when I heard phrases like run a business or run out of time, I was completely confused.
I can see how that would be perplexing. How did you realize that understanding words and sentences was important?
It was when I tried to have conversations with native speakers. I realized that knowing a word's definition is not enough. You need to know how to use it properly. So, I started to read more and pay attention to how words were used in different situations. I also watched movies and listened to podcasts to hear how native speakers use different words.
That's a great strategy, Maria. Understanding words and sentences helps you grasp their full meaning and how to use them naturally. Do you have any tips for our listeners who might be facing the same issue?
Yes. One thing that really helped me was creating flashcards with example sentences instead of just the word and its definition. This way, I could see how the word was used in various contexts. I also tried to use new words in my own sentences when practicing speaking or writing.
Those are excellent tips, Maria. Using flashcards with sentences can definitely help reinforce how words are used in real-life situations.
And speaking of real-life situations, did you have any funny or embarrassing moments because of this habit?
Oh, definitely. I remember once I was in a meeting at work, and I wanted to say that we should analyze the numbers to check our calculations. But I just said, "We should run," and everyone looked at me like, "Why do we need to go for a run?"
It was pretty entertaining.
That's hilarious, Maria. But it also underscores how important it is to understand how to use words correctly.
Absolutely. Well, Maria, thank you so much for sharing your story and tips with us. Before we let you go, we'd like to go over some advanced words and expressions we discussed during our conversation.
Yes. Let's do that. Here are 4 important words and phrases we learned from Maria's story.
The first word is struggles. Struggles means deal with something that is difficult or that causes problems. Maria said, "One of my biggest struggles was trying to learn individual words without understanding how they fit into sentences."
The second expression is out of time. It means to have no time left to do something. For example, we are out of time to finish the project.
Next word is flashcards. Flashcards are cards with information on them, used as a study aid. For example, creating flashcards with example sentences can be very helpful.
And final, entertaining. It means to providing amusement or enjoyment. For example, the movie was very entertaining and made everyone laugh.
Let's repeat them one more time. Struggles, out of time, flashcards, and entertaining. Try to use these words in your practice this week, everyone.
Thank you again, Maria, for joining us. We loved having you on the show.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
All right, listeners, stay tuned for our next guest. We have more intriguing stories and tips coming up.
Our next guest is here to share another common bad habit learning English. Let's welcome John to the show. Hi, John.
Hi, everyone.
It's our pleasure, John. So tell us a bit about yourself and your experience with learning English.
Sure. I'm John, and I've been learning English for about 4 years now. One of my biggest challenges was being a perfectionist and getting hung up on grammar rules. I used to spend so much time trying to make every sentence perfect that it slowed down my progress.
That's a very common issue, John. Can you give us an example of how this affected your learning?
Of course, I remember trying to write an email to a colleague. I spent over an hour just crafting a few sentences because I was so focused on making sure every grammar rule was perfectly followed. By the time I finished, I had run out of time for other important tasks.
Wow, that sounds stressful. How did you realize that this habit was holding you back?
I started to notice that my friends who were less concerned about perfect grammar were becoming more fluent and confident in their speaking and writing. They were making mistakes, but they were communicating effectively. I was often baffled by how quickly they improved.
It's amazing how focusing too much on perfection can actually hinder progress. What did you do to overcome this habit?
I decided to take a different approach. I started to practice speaking and writing more freely, without worrying too much about making mistakes. I also reminded myself that it's okay to make errors, and that learning from them is part of the process. This was very liberating and made my learning experience more enjoyable.
That's a great approach, John. Embracing mistakes as part of the learning process can be very helpful. Do you have any specific tips for our listeners who might be struggling with the same issue?
Yes. One thing that helped me a lot was setting a timer for writing or speaking exercises. I would give myself a limited amount of time to complete a task, which forced me to focus on getting my message across rather than making it perfect. I also practiced with language exchange partners who were very supportive and encouraging.
Those are excellent tips, John. Setting a timer can help prevent overthinking and encourage more natural language use.
And speaking of natural language use, did you have any amusing moments because of this habit?
Oh, definitely. Once I was so focused on using the correct past perfect tense in a conversation that I completely forgot what I was trying to say. My friend was waiting for me to finish my sentence, and I was just standing there, stuck. It was pretty amusing and made us both laugh.
That's a great story, John. It really shows how getting too hung up on grammar can sometimes get in the way of communication.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for sharing your story and tips with us. Before we let you go, we'd like to go over some advanced words and expressions we discussed during our conversation.
Yes, let's do that. Here are 4 important words and phrases we learned from John's story.
Perfectionist is a person who refuses to accept any standard short of perfection. For example, I used to spend so much time trying to make every sentence perfect because I'm a perfectionist.
Hung up on means to be excessively concerned about something. For example, I was getting hung up on grammar rules and it slowed down my progress.
Liberating means to providing a release from restrictions, making you feel free. For example, practicing speaking and writing more freely was very liberating.
Fluent means to be able to speak or write a language easily and accurately. For example, my friends were becoming more fluent and confident in their speaking and writing.
Let's repeat them one more time. Perfectionist, hung up on, liberating, and fluent. Try to use these words in your practice this week, everyone.
Thank you again, John, for joining us. We loved having you on the show.
Thank you, Nikki and Tony. It was great to be here.
Wasn't John's story insightful? It's incredible how being a perfectionist can sometimes slow us down, but by changing our approach, we can make learning more liberating and fun.
Absolutely, Nikki. I loved how John's amusing story about getting stuck mid-sentence highlighted the importance of communication over perfection. I hope our listeners took away some valuable tips from that conversation.
Now, let's move on to our next guest. We have Carly with us today, and she's here to talk about another common bad habit in learning English. Welcome to the show, Carly.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, Carly. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your experience with learning English?
Sure, I'm Carly, and I've been learning English for about 3 years. When I first started, I had this bad habit of translating everything from my native language into English. I felt I needed to understand every single word to grasp the meaning of a sentence, which often left me confused and frustrated.
That's a very common issue, Carly. Can you give us an example of how this habit affected your learning?
Absolutely. I remember reading a simple story in English and stopping every few words to look up translations in a dictionary. It took me forever to get through even a short text, and I often ran out of time to do other practice exercises. I was completely baffled by how slow my progress was.
I can imagine how frustrating that must have been. How did you realize that this habit was holding you back?
I noticed that when I watched English movies or TV shows without subtitles, I could understand the gist of the conversation even without translating every word. This made me realize that understanding the overall meaning was more important than knowing the exact translation of every word.
That's a great insight, Carly. How did you change your approach to overcome this habit?
I started to focus on understanding the context and the overall message rather than getting hung up on individual words. I practiced listening and reading without translating, trying to infer meanings from the context. It was challenging at first, but it got easier with time.
That's an excellent strategy, Carly. Context can indeed help you understand a lot more without needing to translate everything. Do you have any tips for our listeners who might be struggling with the same issue?
Yes. One thing that really helped me was to set aside the dictionary and try to guess the meaning of new words based on the context. I also practiced with language partners who encouraged me to speak and write without translating. This helped me think directly in English.
Those are fantastic tips, Carly. Trying to guess the meaning from context and thinking directly in English can make a huge difference.
And speaking of amusing moments, did you have any funny or embarrassing experiences because of this habit?
Oh, definitely. Once I was at a restaurant and I wanted to ask the waiter for a recommendation. I tried to translate my question from my native language and ended up saying something completely nonsensical. The waiter looked baffled, and my friends couldn't stop laughing. It was pretty amusing in hindsight.
Haha, that's a great story, Carly. It shows how translating can sometimes lead to funny misunderstandings.
Absolutely. Well, Carly, thank you so much for sharing your story and tips with us. Before we let you go, we'd like to go over some advanced words and expressions we discussed during our conversation.
Yes, let's do that. Here are 4 important words and phrases we learned from Carly's story.
Translate means to change words from one language into another. For example, I had this bad habit of translating everything from my native language into English.
Gist is the general meaning or essence of something. For example, I could understand the gist of the conversation even without translating every word.
Infer means to deduce or conclude information from evidence and reasoning rather than from explicit statements. For example, I practiced listening and reading without translating, trying to infer meanings from the context.
Nonsensical means having no meaning, making no sense. For example, I ended up saying something completely nonsensical.
Let's repeat them one more time. Translate, gist, infer, and nonsensical. Try to use these words in your practice this week, everyone.
Thank you again, Carly, for joining us. We loved having you on the show.
Thank you, Nikki and Tony.
Wasn't Carly's story about translating everything so relatable? It's fascinating how focusing too much on translations can slow down our learning process.
Absolutely, Nikki. Her journey to focusing on context and overall meaning is something many of us can learn from. Now, let's welcome our next guest, Sam, who's here to share her experience with another common bad habit in learning English. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Nikki and Tony. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Sam. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself and your experience with learning English?
Sure. I'm Sam, and I've been learning English for about 2 years now. One of my biggest challenges was that I used to focus a lot on reading and listening, but I didn't speak English very often. I thought I could improve just by absorbing information passively.
That's a common trap, Sam. Can you give us an example of how this habit affected your learning?
Certainly. I remember feeling confident in my ability to understand English when reading articles or watching videos. But when it came time to speak in a conversation or give a presentation, I felt completely lost and insecure. I hadn't practiced speaking enough to feel comfortable expressing myself.
I can see how that lack of practice could be challenging. How did you realize that this habit was holding you back?
It became evident when I traveled to an English-speaking country for the first time. I struggled to communicate even basic ideas because I wasn't used to speaking English aloud. I realized then that understanding and speaking are 2 different skills that need separate practice.
That's a crucial realization, Sam. How did you change your approach to overcome this habit?
I started to actively seek opportunities to speak English. I joined conversation groups, attended language exchange events, and even practiced speaking with myself in front of a mirror. The more I spoke, the more confident I became in expressing my thoughts and ideas in English.
Those are fantastic strategies, Sam. Actively practicing speaking is essential for developing fluency and confidence.
And did you have any amusing or memorable moments while trying to overcome this habit?
Oh, definitely. I remember one time I was so nervous during a language exchange that I accidentally mixed up words and said something completely unintended. My conversation partner was confused at first, but then we both ended up laughing about it. It was a funny reminder of how learning involves making mistakes and having fun along the way.
That's a great story, Sam. It shows how important it is to practice speaking in real-life situations.
Absolutely. Well, Sam, thank you so much for sharing your story and tips with us. Before we let you go, we'd like to go over some advanced words and expressions we discussed during our conversation.
Yes. Here are 4 important words and phrases we learned from Sam's story.
Passively means without active participation or effort. For example, I used to focus a lot on reading and listening, but I didn't speak English very often, thinking I could improve passively.
Insecure means not confident or assured. uncertain, and anxious. For example, I felt completely lost and insecure when it came time to speak in a conversation.
Separate means to set or keep apart, not connected. For example, I realize that understanding and speaking are two separate skills that need separate practice.
Confidence is the feeling or belief that one can rely on someone or something. A feeling of self-assurance arising from one's appreciation of one's own abilities or qualities. For example, the more I spoke, the more confident I became in expressing my thoughts and ideas in English.
Let's repeat them one more time. Passively, insecure, separate, and confidence. Try to use these words in your practice this week, everyone.
Thank you again, Sam, for joining us. It was wonderful having you on the show.
Thank you, Nikki and Tony. I had a great time sharing my experiences.
Wasn't Sam's story about learning without speaking often insightful? It's amazing how actively practicing speaking can boost your confidence and fluency in English.
Absolutely, Nikki. Her journey to realizing the importance of speaking practice and overcoming insecurities is something we can all learn from. Today, we've explored several common bad habits in learning English and heard valuable tips from our guests on how to overcome them.
From Maria's experience of learning individual words without context to John's journey as a perfectionist, Carly's struggle with translating too much, and Sam's challenge of learning without speaking often. Each story has provided us with valuable insights and practical strategies.
We hope that you, our listeners, have found these stories and tips helpful in your own English learning journey. Remember, learning a language is a process that involves making mistakes, trying new strategies, and practicing regularly.
Before we close, we want to encourage you to practice speaking English every day. Whether it's with a language partner, in front of a mirror, or even just talking to yourself. Practicing speaking will help you gain confidence and fluency.
And don't forget to listen to our podcast regularly. Subscribe to Learn English with Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Give us a like if you enjoyed today's discussion, and share our podcast with your friends who are also learning English.
Thank you all for tuning in today. We look forward to bringing you more useful tips, engaging stories, and fun conversations in future episodes. Until next time, keep practicing, keep learning, and keep improving your English.
Goodbye, everyone.